France, December 1944. The wind cut through the ruined town of Houffalize like a knife. Snow fell in thick, silent sheets over the carcasses of tanks and trucks, frozen where they died. Beneath a half-collapsed barn, a single light flickered, the dull orange glow of a welding torch. Inside, a man worked alone. His hands were black with oil, his breath visible in the bitter air. Around him lay the gutted remains of a Sherman tank, its engine torn open, pistons cracked, bearings fused from overuse. Fuel drums, Jeep axles, scavenged spark plugs, all scattered like organs awaiting a transplant. They said it couldn't be done, that a Jeep's heart could never power a tank. But with the roads cut, supply convoys stalled, and German armor regrouping nearby, failure was no longer an option. The engineer leaned in, tightening the final bolt. The torch hissed out. He turned the ignition, and for a moment there was nothing. Then a violent cough, a roar, and the monstrous hybrid came to life. Outside, soldiers turned toward the sound. A tank reborn from junkyard bones, a miracle of desperation, a spark of madness, and the beginning of a legend. By the winter of 1944, the Allied advance across Western Europe was beginning to stall. After the breakout from Normandy and the liberation of Paris, momentum had carried the armies of Eisenhower deep into France and Belgium, but at a cost few planners had anticipated. Tanks, the iron backbone of modern warfare, were failing faster than they could be repaired. Engines overheated, transmissions seized, and tracks sheared off on frozen roads. The Sherman, reliable in theory, was proving fragile under months of non-stop combat. Entire armored battalions found themselves immobilized not by enemy fire, but by broken machines and empty fuel drums. In the chaos of war's machinery, one truth had emerged. The battle was not only fought by soldiers with rifles, but by the unseen mechanics who kept those rifles and tanks alive. Behind the front lines, workshops sprang up wherever there was cover. Barns, railway sheds, even abandoned churches. These makeshift depots were manned by men who fought a different kind of battle, with wrenches and welding torches instead of guns. The British called them the REMI, Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers. The Americans had their ordnance and maintenance battalions. Together, they were the pulse that kept the armored spearhead moving eastward. But the pace of war had outstripped the capacity of industry. Every mile gained meant longer supply lines, and fewer spare parts reaching the front. Engines failed faster than replacement shipments could arrive from England or the States. Crews began scavenging from the dead, stripping abandoned Shermans, priests and stewards for anything usable. Sometimes, even that wasn't enough. By late December, the Battle of the Bulge had thrown the Allied front into chaos. Hitler's surprise offensive had cut off supply lines through the Ardennes, trapping entire units in desperate isolation. In towns like Bastogne and Houffalize, repair crews were forced to improvise or perish. Among them was one such unit, a small maintenance detachment attached to the 3rd Armored Division, known among its men for impossible miracles. They called their lead engineer Mac, short for McAllister, a veteran mechanic from Detroit who had once worked in an automobile factory before the war. His knowledge of engines was encyclopedic. His patience with bureaucracy, non-existent. For weeks, Mac and his men had been stranded with 4 inoperable tanks, no spare parts, and the enemy closing in. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Fuel was rationed to the last gallon. And orders were clear. Keep the armor moving, no matter what. When one of their Shermans threw a rod and shattered its crankcase, it was written off as a loss. But Mac refused. "Metal's metal," he told his men. "It just needs to breathe again." That night, by the flicker of oil lamps, he began to strip a wrecked Willys Jeep for parts. He wasn't trying to repair the tank, he was trying to resurrect it. The logic was insane, but rooted in experience. The Jeep's engine was too small to move a full Sherman, but its carburetors, ignition coils, and pistons shared principles with larger engines. If they could replace the ruined intake system and fuse components together through welding and manual calibration, they might, just might, bring the dead tank back to life. To most, it was madness. To Mac, it was engineering under fire. As snow piled up outside and artillery rumbled in the distance, the maintenance crew worked for 3 nights straight. They scavenged fuel lines from destroyed German half-tracks, rewired ignition coils using communication cables, and filled cracks with molten steel from melted shell casings. It wasn't in any manual. But war had long since outgrown manuals. By the dawn of the fourth day, they had something that looked like a machine again. Something alive, if only barely. The sound of that first ignition, that coughing roar of hybrid metal, would echo across the division. A myth in the making. But to understand how this madness took shape and why it mattered, we must go deeper into the world that produced men like McAllister. To understand the birth of such an idea, one has to understand the world that forged it, a world of grease, chaos, and ingenuity under pressure. Before the war, men like McAllister were ordinary craftsmen. They built cars in Detroit, tractors in Ohio, and farm machinery in Iowa. When America entered the war, those same men were drafted or volunteered, and their mechanical intuition became a weapon. They were used to broken tools, unreliable engines, and solving problems with whatever they had on hand. The U.S. Army's armored divisions depended on that mindset. The Sherman tank, officially the M4, was mass-produced in staggering numbers, more than 49,000 built by 1945. But quantity did not mean perfection. It was fast, maneuverable, and easy to manufacture, yet its engine system was a logistical nightmare. Some models used aircraft engines adapted for ground use. Others ran on diesel or multi-fuel systems. The supply chain for their parts was vast and complex. In theory, every broken tank would be recovered, repaired, or replaced. In reality, the front lines moved too fast. Battlefields became graveyards of burnt-out Shermans, each one a silent witness to the mechanical limits of war. By late 1944, tank mechanics were improvising constantly. They cut German Maybach radiators to fit American tanks. They welded armor from destroyed half-tracks. They turned spare Jeep engines into auxiliary generators to keep communication posts alive when the power grid failed. Improvisation wasn't reckless. It was survival. The British faced the same challenges. The Remy detachments working alongside U.S. forces developed a reputation for miracles in the field. In one documented case near Nijmegen, a team rebuilt an entire Cromwell gearbox from 3 destroyed tanks in less than 48 hours, all under enemy shell fire. Another report from Italy described mechanics forging new track links using captured German metal scrap and a local blacksmith's forge. In such an environment, the line between madness and innovation blurred. That's where men like McAllister thrived. He wasn't an officer or a strategist. He was the kind of man who believed machines had souls, that if you listened closely, every engine told you what it needed. Those who worked with him recalled his strange quiet. When others cursed a frozen crankshaft or a stripped gear, he'd light a cigarette, stare at the problem, and simply say, "It's just metal." Metal wants to move. By December, his unit's supply chain had collapsed entirely. They hadn't received a single crate of spare parts in weeks. Every working tank mattered. Every bolt salvaged was a potential life saved. The idea to cannibalize Jeep parts wasn't just desperation, it was a calculated risk. The Jeep's Go Devil engine shared certain characteristics with the Sherman's powertrain architecture: simple carburation, accessible ignition layout, and modular components. The challenge lay in scaling those mechanics, adapting small precision to big force. He started by mapping out the damage. The tank's crankcase was shattered, pistons warped beyond recognition. Replacing those was impossible, but the fuel and air delivery system, if patched and modified, could still breathe life into the surviving cylinders, so he made a decision that would define him. He would graft the Jeep's intake and ignition system directly onto the Sherman's radial engine. It wasn't standard engineering, it was mechanical surgery. His men thought he'd lost his mind. One even joked, "You're building Frankenstein's tank." He didn't laugh. He simply kept working. For 3 days, the barn became a forge. Jeep parts were stripped down, cleaned, and adjusted. Welding sparks mixed with candlelight as they molded fragments of machines meant for different worlds. Every sound outside, artillery, rifle cracks, the distant hum of engines, was a reminder that time was running out. By the time the final bolt was tightened, no one was sure if it would work. They stood back as McAllister connected the ignition line, his gloved hand trembling from exhaustion. The engine turned over once, coughed, and died. Then again, a deeper sound this time, a pulse. When it finally roared to life, the men shouted over the noise, half in disbelief, half in relief. Against every regulation, every expectation, a tank had been reborn, using the heart of a Jeep. That sound wasn't just mechanical. It was symbolic, proof that ingenuity could outfight scarcity, and that moment would be remembered not as an official record, but as a whispered legend among soldiers who had seen what desperation could create. But to truly understand the weight of that act, and the man behind it, we must look at this story from multiple angles. The human, the tactical and the technological forces that collided in that frozen workshop. War has a way of distilling men down to their essence. For McAllister, that essence was precision under pressure, a mechanic who saw beauty in balance, even when surrounded by chaos. By December 1944, most soldiers were running on fumes. Sleep was rare, warmth a luxury. The constant rumble of artillery became a lullaby of exhaustion. For mechanics, the strain was different, not the fear of bullets, but the crushing weight of responsibility. Every stalled tank meant infantry stranded, convoys delayed, and lives at risk. McAllister carried that burden like an anchor. He was no officer, no hero in the traditional sense, but in the eyes of his crew, he was irreplaceable. They trusted him because he never panicked. When engines seized in the middle of night marches, he didn't curse, he listened. He treated machines as living things, speaking in a language only he seemed to understand. Yet behind that calm exterior was something deeper, a growing obsession. Witnesses later described him as possessed during those days in Houffalize. He barely ate, barely slept. When one of his men suggested resting, McAllister replied, "Tanks don't sleep." Neither do I. His madness was not insanity, and it was purpose stripped to its rawest form. In war, genius often looks unhinged. The longer the odds, the more madness resembles faith. When he welded Jeep pistons into a tank engine, he wasn't chasing glory. He was simply trying to keep his brothers alive. That simple, grim motivation, to move forward, to keep the line breathing, was what separated men like him from the rest. In the quiet moments between battles, soldiers found meaning not in victory, but in survival. McAllister's act was survival, crystallized into metal. On paper, McAllister's project was absurd. The Jeep's Willys Go Devil engine was a 4-cylinder power plant producing around 60 horsepower. The Sherman's radial engine, depending on the variant, generated between 350 and 400 horsepower. They were designed for different universes. One to move a lightweight reconnaissance vehicle, the other to propel a 30-ton tank through mud and snow. But McAllister wasn't trying to replace the entire engine. He was trying to resuscitate it. The Sherman's radial Continental R975 had a catastrophic weakness. It was originally derived from aircraft engines, built for high RPMs and constant maintenance. In the field, dirt and cold ruined them. One shattered crankcase could take weeks to replace, weeks they didn't have. The Jeep, on the other hand, was a marvel of simplicity. Its ignition coils, carburetor, and timing design were easy to repair and flexible enough to modify. McAllister realized that by adapting the Jeep's fuel and ignition systems to the damaged tank engine, he could bypass the destroyed intake section altogether. He began machining adapters by hand, using melted scrap from destroyed artillery shells. His team fabricated new linkage systems from bent wrenches and leftover throttle rods. The welding process was brutal: iron, steel, and aluminum fused together with more hope than science. Incredibly, it worked. The hybrid engine didn't deliver full power, but it produced just enough torque to move the Sherman at low speed. Enough to reposition, enough to fight another day. It was, by every technical standard, a field miracle. And in that frozen barn, McAllister unknowingly demonstrated one of the core principles of wartime engineering: modular adaptability. After the war, Allied studies on field improvisation directly referenced cases like his. The philosophy became the foundation of post-war design doctrines, emphasizing interchangeable components, simplified repair systems, and field-friendly technology. The mad act of a mechanic in a snow-covered barn would later echo through decades of military engineering, from the M48 Patton's modular maintenance systems to the repair doctrines of NATO armor divisions. In the grand narratives of war, we often remember the generals, not the grease-stained men in the shadows. Yet time and again, history has proven that logistics and repair are as decisive as strategy. During the winter of 1944, tank availability across the Western Front plummeted. Of the roughly 2,500 Shermans deployed in the Ardennes, nearly one-third were immobilized not by German fire, but by mechanical failure. Cold weather thickened lubricants, froze batteries, and cracked engines. Every repaired tank was a weapon restored, a silent victory before the next firefight. McAllister's repaired Sherman wasn't just a technical feat, it was a tactical lifeline. That single tank, once revived, allowed his unit to maintain defensive coverage of a key crossroads near Houffalize during the retreat phase of the Bulge offensive. With limited artillery support, that tank's restored mobility reportedly prevented a German probe from cutting through the convoy. Such incidents rarely made it into official reports. They weren't battles, they were survival acts. Decisions made by sergeants and corporals under conditions generals could barely imagine. The tactical doctrine of mobility as survival was reaffirmed in those weeks. A tank that could move was a tank that could fight. A tank that couldn't was a tomb. And so, when McAllister's hybrid roared to life and rolled forward through the snow, it wasn't a spectacle. It was strategy, born from desperation. One more machine saved, one more position held. And though the official history would never name him, the men who watched that machine move again would carry the memory long after the war ended. It was a story that lived not in newspapers, but in whispers, told in maintenance depots, passed down to new recruits, each adding their own awe to the legend of the mad mechanic. But his story, like all legends, had more sides: leadership struggles, enemy observations, and moral questions about what madness means in war. For every act of innovation in war, there is a wall of regulation standing in its way. In the Allied command structure, field engineering was bound by layers of orders, manuals, and maintenance codes. Every repair, modification, or part substitution was supposed to follow procedure, in theory. But theory dissolves quickly under artillery fire. When McAllister's superiors learned that he had torn apart an official U.S. Army Jeep to resurrect a tank, they were furious. Reports suggest that an ordnance officer threatened disciplinary action for unauthorized equipment cannibalization. But that officer wasn't in Houffalize when the snow froze the engines and the enemy artillery echoed through the valley. In moments like those, command rules meant little. Survival made its own logic. The truth is, Allied success in Europe depended on men who disobeyed quietly, those who ignored paperwork to keep tanks moving, trucks running, and convoys alive. It was a quiet rebellion beneath the structure of war, mechanics and engineers rewriting procedure with every improvised fix. Many officers understood this. Some turned a blind eye, knowing that strict obedience to manuals would cripple their divisions. A few even protected the Mavericks, shielding them from disciplinary reports. McAllister's case became one such incident. The commanding captain, aware that his unit's entire defense relied on that single tank, simply said, "If it runs, it's authorized." That decision symbolized a turning point in Allied field leadership. The recognition that innovation could not be dictated from headquarters, it had to be born in the field. It was a lesson written not in doctrine, but in oil and fire. The battlefield rewards results, not regulations. On the other side of the frozen lines, the Germans were watching. By December 1944, Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS units were exhausted, undersupplied, and fighting in the same brutal cold. Yet they still held respect, even reluctant admiration, for the mechanical discipline of their opponents. Captured reports from the Ardennes revealed something remarkable. German intelligence had noted the Allies' improvised recovery and adaptation efforts. They documented cases where destroyed tanks reappeared days later, somehow operational again. To them, it seemed almost supernatural. German engineers, long proud of their precision, were bound by complexity. The Panther and Tiger tanks were engineering masterpieces, but their beauty was their curse. A broken gearbox or damaged road wheel could immobilize a Tiger for days, even weeks. Replacement parts had to come from factories deep within Germany, which by late 1944 were being bombed nightly. The Allies, by contrast, treated machinery with brutal practicality. If something broke, they fixed it, or rebuilt it with whatever was on hand. It was a mindset that horrified German officers, who saw it as crude, undisciplined, and yet terrifyingly effective. In one German after-action report near St. Vith, an officer wrote, "Their vehicles are not repaired. They are resurrected." That word, resurrected, captures how the enemy viewed Allied mechanics. Not as engineers, but as sorcerers of machinery, capable of breathing life into the dead. McAllister's hybrid tank was one among countless similar acts. German prisoners who later saw it, its mismatched exhaust and uneven armor, reportedly nicknamed it Der Bastardpanzer, the bastard tank. To them, it symbolized the Allied advantage, adaptability over elegance, quantity over perfection, improvisation over rigidity, and in the brutal arithmetic of war, that adaptability won. War changes the definition of sanity. In the calm of peace, dismantling one vehicle to breathe life into another would seem eccentric. In the fire of battle, it was logic itself. McAllister's act, and others like it, embodied a moral paradox. War's greatest acts of creativity are born from destruction. The same mind that designs engines to save lives can, under pressure, use that genius to take them. He never saw himself as a hero. To him, it was work. But in retrospect, that night in the barn was more than repair. It was defiance. A statement that human ingenuity would not be frozen by the cold, starved by scarcity, or silenced by command. The men who watched him work began to believe that nothing was impossible. That belief, that faith in problem-solving, spread faster than any official morale speech could. When you witness a machine thought dead rise again, something changes in you. You begin to think survival itself can be engineered, and that's what McAllister gave them. Not a functioning tank, but hope with an engine. His madness became a quiet weapon. It reminded those around him that in war, innovation isn't optional, it's oxygen. Years later, historians would call it the field repair revolution. But in truth, it was something older, as ancient as human struggle. When cornered, man adapts. When denied, he creates. When trapped, he invents a way out. That's what the mad engineer represented. Not insanity, not luck, but the enduring truth that survival itself is the most powerful form of intelligence. As the engine roared and the tank rolled out into the frozen dawn, the war around them had already reached its own turning point. The Ardennes offensive was beginning to falter. But for McAllister's crew, that morning would become the moment everything changed. The legend was born in that roar. And soon it would be tested under fire. At dawn, the valley was a sheet of white fire. Shell bursts lit the fog like thunderclouds. The German column had found them, half-tracks and Panzer IVs grinding down the frozen road, infantry spilling into the fields like a black tide. The men of C Company braced for death. They had a single tank, the Frankenstein, and barely enough ammunition to hold for 10 minutes. The mechanic climbed up into the turret, grease still smeared across his face. He wasn't supposed to fight, but there were no more tankers left. The last crew had been killed the night before, burned alive in their steel coffin. Now the man who built the machine would have to drive it into hell himself. Mount up, he growled. We're not dying in a barn, the Sherman roared to life, louder, meaner, faster than it ever should have been. The hybrid engine screamed like a beast unchained. As the hatch slammed shut, the mechanic glanced at a photo taped to the panel. His wife, his son. Then he jammed the throttle. They burst through the farmhouse wall, bricks exploding outward. The soldiers behind him froze in disbelief. That broken tank, the one nobody thought could move, now tore down the road like a charging bull. The Germans never expected a counterattack. Within seconds, the Frankenstein was among them. The first shell punched straight through a half-track, turning it into molten debris. The second hit a Panzer before it could rotate its turret, ammunition cooking off in a column of orange flame. The mechanic didn't stop. He kept driving straight through the chaos, using the Jeep hybrid engine to perform impossible maneuvers, tight turns, bursts of speed that standard tanks couldn't dream of. Every shot he fired found metal. Every turn he took defied the physics of fear. To the men watching from the hills, it looked like madness. To the Germans, it looked like the devil himself had climbed into a Sherman. When the smoke cleared, 10 enemy vehicles lay burning in the snow. The road was silent again, save for the hiss of melting ice and the groan of the engine that shouldn't have lived long enough to fight. Inside the tank, the mechanic sat still. The fuel gauge was empty. The engine coughed twice, then died. He exhaled, slowly, and looked out at the battlefield his machine had turned into a graveyard. That was his last run. His last gamble, and against all odds it worked. By nightfall, reinforcements had arrived. The Germans pulled back, believing the Americans had more tanks hidden in the woods. The mechanic didn't correct them. He just climbed out, wiped the soot from the photo of his family, and sat on the armor that had defied death one final time. Some men called it luck. Others called it divine madness. But those who'd seen it, who'd watched that broken machine charge into the teeth of the enemy, called it something else entirely, a miracle of war. When the sun rose the next morning, the snow around Hufvudstaden was still burning. The fields were littered with the wrecks of panzers and the blackened husks of trucks, frozen monuments to one man's impossible stand. They found the mechanic asleep beside his tank, wrapped in a tarp, his face streaked with oil and ash. The Frankenstein sat silent beside him, its hull peppered with shrapnel, tracks cracked and engine beyond repair. It had given everything it had, just like its maker. For days, the story spread across the 84th Infantry Division like wildfire. Some swore the man had taken down 10 German vehicles single-handedly. Others said it was 12. Nobody could say for sure. The only thing everyone agreed on was this. Without that insane half-machine, half-miracle tank, the road to Bastogne might have fallen that day. The Army never officially recorded the kill count. The mechanic never asked them to. When a journalist later found him in a field hospital, his arm bandaged and his body half-burned, he just shrugged. "I didn't build it to be remembered," he said. "I built it because we were out of time." The war rolled on. New tanks arrived. Supply lines reopened. The Frankenstein was dragged off the road, stripped for parts, and quietly forgotten. Just another ghost of the Ardennes. But among the men who fought there, its legend never died. They spoke of the night a broken machine came roaring out of the dark, spitting fire and madness, a tank that shouldn't have existed, built by a man who refused to surrender to logic, fear, or fate. And every time they told the story, the number grew a little higher. 10 kills became 11. 11 became 15. Because in war, truth bends toward the shape of legend. Somewhere in a Belgian museum today, a single Sherman road wheel sits under glass. The plaque beneath it reads, "Recovered near Hufvudstaden, 1944. Believed to belong to an improvised tank used in the Battle of the Bulge. Engineer unidentified. No name. No medals. Just steel. But for the soldiers who lived because of him, that was enough." In the frozen heart of the Ardennes, where fire met snow and reason gave way to survival, one man's madness became his army's salvation. The world remembers great generals, grand offensives and maps drawn in red arrows. But sometimes, it's the nameless, sleepless, grease-covered few who turn the course of a war. The ones who don't command battalions, but command sparks, bolts, and broken engines. That winter, the Frankenstein tank was not a symbol of power. It was a symbol of defiance, proof that ingenuity could stand where industry could not. That even in the ruins of Europe, surrounded by death and cold, the human mind refused to surrender. No one ever found the name of that mad engineer. No record, no photograph, only a whisper passed down through men who swore they saw light and thunder rise from a pile of scrap. And so the legend lives, not in museums or medals, but in the eternal rhythm of engines that still roar in his memory. Because sometimes, the line between madness and genius isn't drawn in ink or blood. It's drawn in the roar of a machine that shouldn't have lived, but did.